Welcome to another episode of Chat with Chet. Today we're joined by Zach Erdmann from Immersive to talk about a topic that's becoming increasingly critical and important, and that is cyber readiness. Not just about compliance, not check boxes, but actual measurable team-wide preparedness from real-world attacks. So Zach, maybe just give us a brief introduction about yourself, background, and maybe some insights on how Immersive, at a high level approaches this concept of cyber readiness.
Thank you, Chet. My name is Zach. I'm the lead solutions consultant at Immersive, and I also lead our U.S. public sector practice. I have a background in risk, ranging from financial risk to third-party risk. But at Immersive, our focus is on cyber risk and readiness. And really, our goal is to help leaders in the public sector and the private sector be able to answer questions about their readiness and their resiliency, especially when it comes to the people that make up their cybersecurity teams. It can be a difficult question to answer, but we have some exciting ways to help overcome some of those challenges. Thank you for having me on today.
No, appreciate it, and definitely appreciate your time. So excited for the conversation. We hear this a lot. We hear organizations say we're compliant. We hear this all over the place. Hey, we're compliant. We do all these things. Why isn't that enough?
Yeah,
Just to say we're
excellent question.
compliant.
Compliance is a function of readiness, and being compliant with cybersecurity standards is a good starting point for establishing best practices. But compliance doesn't always measure the skills of people and the impact that people have on cybersecurity. So we often think of the triad of people, processes, and tools, and compliance usually focuses more heavily on the processes and the tools. But with people, it might be something simple like they've taken a phishing exercise or they've taken part in a basic tabletop. So oftentimes what gets missed from a leadership perspective are the metrics that would help us to say, we're prepared for the latest cybersecurity threat because we understand the currency and the skills of our teams, and we understand that they, have recently exercised, they work well together. We've accounted for turnover on our teams, and we know that as of this moment, we're prepared for the threats to.
Yeah, all good. One of the things that you alluded to, and that comes to mind, is this concept of compliance really does not equal readiness, right?
Absolutely.
And we're this conversation about we really need a shift in the mindset of how people think about this. So we think about training, right? A
hmm
lot of organizations will say, "Hey, we've done training," and they'll it becomes a checkbox exercise. And so why do they do that? Why do those organizations treat training just as that? Oh, yep, we just check the box, and maybe interested in your thoughts on why that may not be enough.
Yeah, of course. So that type of check the box training kind of falls into categories that we would think of as legacy training approaches. And a lot of times the approach is because it's something that's quantifiable. So if I know that somebody has gone to a certification course, at least I could say that they're certified to perform a certain role or a certain task. But the reason that doesn't always equal readiness is because it lacks things like the currency or the relevancy of the training that somebody's had to a role. And oftentimes those types of training approaches that are instructor led or are video based are either expensive or they lag kind of the latest threats in cybersecurity. So at Immersive, we encourage the organizations that we work with to think about the currency of training and the realism of the experience that participants are getting. So, for instance, we put people in front of a virtual machine where if they're learning a skill or a competency, they're learning by doing. And we think for the individual, it's a more effective way of retaining the information that they're learning. And because they're visiting those kind of training modules more regularly, those skills stay fresh and current as opposed to maybe a certification that they got several years ago from an instructor-led course. But then from a leadership perspective, it's producing metrics that are going to help us to quantify the readiness of our team. I know if somebody's demonstrated that they understand the TTPs of the latest advanced persistent threat group, I could be more confident that they'll respond properly if we're, ever attacked by that organization.
Yeah. So, and I think you alluded to it here just a minute ago, but when we think of readiness in the context of cybersecurity, you know, why is that actually more important than just being able to say we're compliant?
Because, I mean, truthfully, it's the readiness that is going to matter when things go south and organizations are trying to protect the mission. Truth be told, compliance is not always a great predictor of how organizations perform when things go south. We say when it's pizza and Red Bull time. So resiliency and readiness comes from practice and experience and confidence that gets built from training and exercising together. And that's the approach at Immersive that we take. We want to take some of the guesswork out of our readiness by allowing people to practice with the latest threats and show that they're ready in a way that's more measurable from like a people and skills perspective.
Yeah. So what does it look like then if an organization treats readiness as something that is strategic, a long-term investment? How does that differ?
Yeah, absolutely. So organizations that are looking at readiness in the long term are forward planning for, how do we bring people up to a threshold that we know makes them effective in their role within our organization? And in some ways, can we plan for eventual turnover, for changes in the cybersecurity landscape? Can we help maintain the best people, especially in a public sector context where the private sector is a big draw for cybersecurity professionals? It's hard to hire people into cybersecurity roles. We can take recent policies like DoD 8140 that help to define the expectations of what it means to be a cybersecurity professional in a DoD context, for instance. And strategic leaders can identify individuals that, they might be qualified for their current role, but because of the competencies they've demonstrated in their training, they're actually 80% of the way towards a secondary role that might be of more value to the mission. So if they can help encourage those individuals to take the necessary training and develop the skills they need to change into that more valuable role, it presents those individual contributors a way to grow and encouragement to stay within the role. But then those leaders could also see, here are roles that I'm able to fill, that I am confident that I can train people to be effective in this place, and which roles are difficult to hire for and difficult to train people into. And they can begin forward planning for that hiring and recruiting process.
Yeah, and I think you really hit on a few minutes ago the challenges with the legacy approach with cybersecurity training. But if we think about a shift to some more modern approaches,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I know, and we've talked about this before. Crisis simulations, these hands-on labs, getting like you talked about, getting in front of a VM. How is that really better preparing teams for the actual real deal, real thing when something happens?
Yeah, absolutely. Cybersecurity is a team sport. A lot of legacy training approaches tend to be individually focused. So I, an individual, go to a course, I receive XYZ certification. But when you're performing kind of an incident response or you're monitoring logs, there is the aspect of like understanding and intuiting what you see in those logs and the evidence that you see from the tools that you're using. But there's also the soft skills in working with a team, dividing up the process of investigation, and even most importantly, communicating with non-technical people. So this is an area at Immersive that we've seen a need, and we're trying to come up with more creative ways to exercise both technical and non-technical people in incident response processes. So, if I'm a cybersecurity professional, I might see that a suspicious actor loaded a DLL file somewhere on our network and recognize that could be malware, and there's all these subsequent risks and follow-ups I should take. But if I say that there's a suspicious DLL file on a network to somebody who's not technical, they don't understand that same risk context. And if you don't practice, then they don't know what to anticipate. And in the midst of a crisis, it can be difficult for technical and non-technical people to communicate effectively. So, for instance, we run cyber drills where we bring those groups together and simulate these incidences so they can practice like they play, and they can take some of the heat off when it comes to the real thing.
Yeah, and I think that's key, and I think that goes back. A lot of people will tell you and say, "Well, hey, it's really hard to actually simulate a realistic crisis." But to your point, right? This is a team sport, so being able to simulate and practice this in real time across everybody that is involved becomes critical as it relates to readiness and how everybody's going to behave, what they're going to do, what roles they're going to take when a real crisis actually happens. So,
Absolutely.
um, so obviously readiness is a big thing, and that's really the key to some of our conversations here. But how does how would an organization quantify cyber readiness? I mean,
Hmm.
how would we what would you tell somebody to say? Well, how would we measure? Are we ready? Are we not ready? How do they know?
Great question. We think it's helpful to tie that training activity that people are doing to get ready to proxies that help us better, align what we're doing as a team and our measures of risk to the threats that are out there. So a great example is if I know, an advanced persistent threat group, like say Salt Typhoon, has specific TTPs that they use in an attack, it stands to reason that if I'm ready for that attack from that group, I need to know that my team is familiar with their modus operandi and that they know how to respond if they see these techniques in practice within their organization. So that's an area where sometimes legacy training approaches are not fast enough to keep up with cyber or don't help prove that like multiple people on our team are aware of how to respond. So at Immersive, for instance, when we build our training curriculums and our modules, we tie the techniques and competencies that people learn from the labs that they do in our platform to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And we can show leaders, if we look at our team as a whole, here are areas where we have strong coverage. Here are areas where we might be lacking in coverage. And here are the TTPs that the latest threats in the threat landscape use. So then, as a leader, I could say to other stakeholders within my group, I think we're prepared for the latest threats because we have as much coverage as possible on the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We've practiced recently on the threats and the TTPs that the latest threats are going to bring to bear against our organization. Or alternatively, like we've identified gaps, but we have a plan to close those gaps. And those gaps can come from changes in the threat landscape. They could come from changes in personnel, people retiring, leaving, moving to different parts of the organization. Readiness is not like a race where there's a finish line. It's something that's continuous. So having those helpful proxies that relate more specifically to what people are going to see in the field help leaders quantify their readiness a bit better than maybe like, traditional, like compliance based modes of like reporting can.
Yeah, so I'm pretty familiar with the Immersive platform, and one of my favorite features is in some of the training, and like if you do a simulation, you can actually ask people what their confidence level is about some of their answers.
Mm-hmm.
I do love that, right? They may get the right answer, but they're like, I just totally guessed, or I'm kind of sure or not sure. I think this is actually a very powerful indicator for organizations to actually be able to do that, continually across the platform as they help people, and are training people as part through some of these labs. I'm interested in your take on this concept of tracking, the confidence level of these answers and how that might help organizations make decisions related to performance and yeah, performance and readiness.
I'm glad you asked because that's one of my favorite metrics that we capture in our exercises because it reveals so much about the readiness of different teams. If I'm a leader and I need to report on my confidence that my team is ready for the latest threats, how can I really do that if I don't know the confidence level of the people that are actually going to be responding to them? So when we run those types of exercises, we'll present people with common circumstances that they're going to see in real life. And it can even be basic things like at this stage, what is the criticality level of the threat that we're seeing? Or is it too early to activate a security incident response team based on evidence that we're seeing in the logs? And a lot of times, cybersecurity professionals might get the answer correct. They can intuit it from prior experience. They maybe, have been in this role for a long time and understand, what makes sense to do. But in that same vein, like sometimes that knowledge can be institutional, and it's hard to show whether that institutional knowledge is being transmitted to new people on the team. So by simply asking people to self-report on their confidence level, we could identify these kind of edge cases where people made the right choice, but they weren't very confident, and that might indicate that they'd make a different choice in the future. Or kind of the strangest result we see sometimes is when a team is highly confident in the wrong response. And that intersection of like the quality of the response against the confidence of the response is a really good way of shortening the time it takes to improving playbooks and incident response plans. If I can identify those pain points, I then know where to focus my energy in making improvements to kind of, thinking of things like an OODA loop concept, right? Like if I could shorten that time to a decision by pre-planning, by having playbooks that people are aware of, then we're going to be more effective as a team when it comes to real incident response.
Yeah. So, and I think you've hit on the concept of why sort of cyber drills and how that really differs from traditional training, and I think there's huge value in that. And we think about this capturing these confidence levels. So if we're talking to leadership, how does an organizational leadership use this data to better understand and maybe support their own teams or figure out what they should do with this data? What's in it for them?
Yeah, there's a lot to be gained for leaders in the cybersecurity context in both the public and the private sector. What we find is that CISOs, for instance, and other leaders in security are often on the outside looking in when it comes to strategic decision making or those like organizational wide conversations. They're seen as risk reduction, but it's sometimes difficult to show the impact that the decisions and the preparation they have on their team have on the overall organization. So having metrics that show, we are effectively improving the skills of our team. We're making a meaningful change in the cybersecurity awareness culture within our organization. We have prepared for the latest cybersecurity threats. Allow these leaders to bring more data to bear to these conversations and more successfully advocate for the things that they need to give themselves the confidence to ensure that they're ready for their mission, that their teams are going to perform. And even, when we think of like forward planning for hiring and preparation, they can more easily advocate for the roles and the personnel that they need to support their mission today and retain the good people that they have.
Yeah, and so you talk about hiring.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of talk about cybersecurity workforce shortages, that there's not enough people to do the job. Um, what I'm interested, what are organizations getting wrong about how they approach that? And then also what are they doing right in
Mm-hmm.
how do they approach that problem?
So I think what they're doing right is oftentimes a willingness to invest in the people that they have. So when I speak to managers of cybersecurity teams, more so than in other industries that I've been, they're willing to hear what their individual contributors are interested in. They are more likely to ask what resources they need to be successful in their job. But one of the challenges is an over reliance on trying to bring in people that are already senior, have bona fides to hit the ground running. It's a very small pool of individuals that are prepared and have like years of experience and certifications. Organizations struggle to identify potential candidates that are more junior in their career, or even people who might have an aptitude for cybersecurity but are in a different role today. And because they don't really have training mechanisms to teach people a foundational level and help them kind of make that career transition, there's people in like GRC organizations today that work for help desks, that are engineers, that would be good cybersecurity professionals. They just don't understand the path to make that transition. And so in the federal space, we're trying to help these leaders recognize where they have people with this aptitude to help them grow into these more important roles within their organization. And we've had a lot of success lately in both the DoD and with our partners in the Five Eyes, like the UK MOD.
Yeah, and that I think is key, right? And I think you hit it on the head. There are a lot of people that exist out there who are interested in cybersecurity, who may not necessarily come from traditional backgrounds, but are one interested, two, and more than capable in doing the job. So for organizations to be able to have a path that can invest and take advantage of that, I'll call it maybe a non-traditional um, hiring pool. It might come from a different stream, and think about it that way, I think is going to be critical out there. Um, and so specifically public sector, we both spend a lot of our time in the public sector. A lot of stuff going on, a lot of turmoil right now.
Yeah,
I'm,
unfortunately.
I'm interested in your view as we think about some of these challenges. What are some of these challenges that specifically public sector is having as it relates to trying to help and grow their cyber talent pipelines?
Yeah, I think there's several that they are faced with. I think the one that people see most easily is just the draw to the private sector, right? The pay might be better. There's some very like exciting companies out there that are looking for these same qualified individuals. But then also even within public sector, it's hard sometimes for individuals to see how to grow and develop their career. So if I feel like I don't know, what's next for me in my professional track, I might be encouraged to look elsewhere. Or, once my time is up in the DoD, I might consider moving to the private sector. And then public sector has this added challenge that some of these agencies are competing against one another for the same pool of individuals. So if I'm, a highly qualified cybersecurity professional, I might be getting asked to, by the DOJ, by DHS, by the DoD for my expertise. So what we have found to be effective, and I think policy has borne this out too, is that by presenting people with a more straightforward understanding of here is how to, here's what you need to know to succeed in this role. And then here is the next logical career progression in this role or similar roles. People will be more likely to stick around if they see how they can grow. So I think that was the foundation of like the national cybersecurity workforce and education strategy for the civilian side of the house. And then it's also borne out in DoD 8140 and the DCWF work roles that they define. So in our platform, we align our more granular modules that are based on competencies into like curriculums that align to these different career paths. So if I'm a member of a SOC, but I'm interested in pen testing, I can learn what skills I need to transition into that role and get that satisfaction. And I'd be more likely to stay with an organization that allows me to explore and move into those paths. And I think that's really at the heart of some of these, laws and policies that we've seen lately is can we present people with these paths and encourage them to see, what's in store for them and use that as a mechanism to help retain these good people that we've invested in and trained to be successful in a cybersecurity context.
Fantastic. Well, as we get close to time here, I'm curious, right? So, what would be one piece of advice that you would give any of the leaders or anybody listening today on how to start moving forward to a more proactive readiness focused culture? What would that guidance be?
That's a very interesting question. I think my guidance one is to act, right? It's important to begin taking steps to make improvements. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to be asking very like large existential questions. If we think about our confidence metric, if you ask yourself today, is my team ready for the latest cyber threats? If you have questions about that, think about what would change your view. Is it, finding more appropriate or recent training that would help my team show that they're ready for the latest threats? Is it running exercises so I can see how my team performs under pressure? Is it, finding new talent to fill some of the roles that I've traditionally struggled to fill? Looking at that holistically, I think, is a good way to approach the steady improvement process.
Yeah, absolutely. All great advice. Well, Zach, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat today. Definitely, this is a very relevant topic, and I think will continue to be relevant, for the foreseeable future.
Mhm.
And so, for those folks tuning in, we appreciate you taking a few minutes to join us on this episode with Chat with Chet. And remember, to Zach's point, think about cyber readiness, right? It's not about checkbox and compliance, but it really is about action, actual measurable team-wide preparedness. And so again, Zach, appreciate your time, and to everybody else, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having
Have a
me,
great
Chet.
day.